Hey guys, Philip here from Manning the Fort, and today I want to talk about what happened when I apparently went insane and decided to do 5 different types of non-metallic metal on a single miniature. If you're new to the channel, to tell you a little bit about me, I am not one of those amazingly talented painters that you see all over this platform. What I am is someone who just really started to take painting seriously a little bit over a year ago at this point, and my goal is to impart some of the things that I've learned over the past year or so of trying basically every tutorial on YouTube that I could find. So, but back to this guy. So the Implausible Nature Discord server, which if you're a Black Templars player, you should absolutely be on this Discord server. They have a small painting competition. And the rules were that you could paint up any Black Templar infantry non-HQ unit. And even though this is just one guy, he's an elite's choice, so he's allowed. The problem was that I realized pretty quickly that this one dude was going to be up against full units. So I realized I was going to have to kind of go the extra mile in some way for this guy. And the way I decided to do that was to go harder, basically, on non-metallic metal than I ever have before. So let's get into the footage and see how I did.
I start with his weathered black armor. I think in the last 18 months I've tried at least 10 different methods of painting black. I have done non-metallic metal black before and been pretty happy with it, but if you've seen my Templars, you know I prefer a battle-worn look. Turns out there are ways to get the weathered look I want by using the same method for non-metallic metal black with slightly different techniques. For a black non-metallic metal look, the best starting point I've found is to start with an off black. A lot of how good an NMM effect looks comes down to contrast, so leaving yourself room to push the shadows darker is a good thing. My go-to for this is Pro Acryl Dark Neutral Gray. After I get that blocked in, we come to the part of non-metallic metal, and especially black non-metallic metal, that I initially found the most intimidating, sketching in those main highlight areas. Shapes like cylinders and spheres all have rules for where light should go, but my own mental block was always with going bright enough on that initial highlight pass. In fact, this is my second try with this exact model because I decided it wasn't bright enough the first time. Don't be afraid to get pretty close to white. To sketch these areas in, I'm using blue-gray from AK Interactive's 3rd generation acrylics. Or maybe it's gray-blue. There's 2 colors with the names reversed, and this is the lighter of the 2. It's a rather light, desaturated gray with a very slightly cool shift. I did thin this down a bit, about 1:1, with glaze medium. Then, instead of brushing it on like I normally would, I kind of stippled the highlights on, using intentionally uneven strokes and leaving little gaps where the darker gray shows through. I follow the shapes as best I can, following the rules of light, while still being a little intentionally sloppy, till I've got a pretty decent light sketch. Next, to help transition, I mix both my bright gray and my dark neutral gray about 50-50, and I thin it down a lot. I end up somewhere around 3:1 with a mix of glaze medium and water to paint because I want it pretty transparent. Then I use a similar technique as before, focusing on where the dark gray meets my highlights to ease that transition. Again, I'm still being intentionally uneven, so the surface looks rougher. I emphasize that roughness by going back in with a thinner application of my light gray, and I add some tiny scratches here and there on the armor in various places, especially around the boots. Now, the glazing game begins. For cool shifted black, I haven't found anything better than Payne's Gray acrylic ink. This is from Dollar Rowney's FW ink line. If you're new to acrylic inks, they are very pigment rich, so to get a good glaze consistency, you have to thin them way down. Also, they don't have a binder in them like normal acrylic paint does, so a little bit of medium is a must to be able to maintain control when you thin it. If you're not ready to jump into acrylic inks, something like Incubi Darkness from Citadel or Pro Acryl's Black Blue could probably work. I get this glaze a lot thinner than I would for a tabletop model, since this is for a competition, so being able to establish a nice gradient matters. The first layer of this glaze covers almost everything I've done so far, with just a little bit of the brightest areas left mostly uncovered. When you're working this thin, you're going to want to wipe most of the glaze off the brush to avoid it flooding the area and causing problems. As I continue, I limit that dark glaze further and further into the shadows to build it up slowly. This many thin glazes take a long time to dry, and you want them dry before you go back in or you'll tear up a partially wet layer underneath and ruin your progression. To keep the flow going, I start to block in other areas while those glazes dry. Also, my best friend when doing a ton of transparent glazes like this is a hairdryer. Once the glaze gets pretty settled in an area and I don't think the blow dryer will move it around, I use that to speed up the drying process so I can lay down the next layer. You may see me continuing to glaze down the black as I do a lot of the other work I'm going to describe here. For the areas that are going to be gold, I start from AK Interactive's Japanese Brown. From there, I hit the highlights with Vallejo Ice Yellow and the shaded areas with glazes made from raw umber ink. Eventually, I come back and hit the extreme highlights with Pro Acryl Bright Ivory. Bright Ivory is my favorite color for extreme highlights on a lot of things, as it's not quite as harsh as white and is a little warm. It's particularly good for non-metallic metal gold since it has just a tiny bit of yellow in there. I eventually decide later on that my gold needs a little bump of yellow, so I'll add a final glaze out of very thinned down Nasdrag yellow contrast to richen up that gold tone a bit. The leather coat, skull helmet, mask, and gloves all get a layer of Pro Acryl Black Brown, and the gun holster and sword grip get Pro Acryl Mahogany. I'm later going to mix those base colors up with some Pro Acryl Bright Ivory and stipple and scratch in the highlights. I thin down some sepia ink and give that a somewhat thicker glaze to unify the color a bit more on the leather. His skull helmet then gets a solid coat of bright ivory. For the other metallic areas, I decide I want a copper look on his little belt reliquary thing and a more bronzy look for that big hourglass. I block those in with Pro Acryl Burnt Sienna and Citadel Xandri Dust respectively. To highlight these, I just mix the base colors with bright ivory to get each progressive level of brightness. Then there's the chains and metal area of his backpack. For this, I lean on the one-man encyclopedia of miniature painting, Vince Venturella. Seriously, if you have a question on how to do almost any technique imaginable, Vince probably has a video for it. For a steel non-metallic metal, Vince uses a progression between Vallejo Dark Sea Blue for the shadows and Ice Yellow for the main highlights. Now, time for the sword. This damn sword probably took me as long as the entire rest of the model, though I am happy with how it turned out. Again, I went with Vince's method, blocking in general highlights and shadows with Ice Yellow and Dark Sea Blue, and then mixing them together in some of the midpoints. I will eventually change where I place the lights from how I initially do it here, as it just ends up looking off to me. One great piece of advice Vince gives for non-metallic metal is to try to avoid making rectangles of light and shadow. The eye reads it much easier if you work with triangles of light instead. Also, edge highlights help a lot with selling the contrast. For those, I jump all the way back up to bright ivory, and I also use that to add some of the scratches along the blade, because I want it to look like he's been, hitting things. Also of note, even though I think this part of the sword would be in shadow, part of it is right behind that skull helmet, so I need it to reflect that lighter color as well. Light placement for non-metallic metal is something I'm still trying to get the hang of. Like I said, I end up going back and adjusting things later on, which you'll see in the finished product. Once those areas are blocked in, though, it's time to go back to the glazing game. So I return to Payne's Gray to deepen the darker parts and mix up a glaze that's part ice yellow and part bright ivory for the highlights. Glazing with lighter colors can be tricky since they often cause a significant jump in value pretty abruptly, and that's especially true the closer you get to pure white, so keep that in mind if you try something like this later on. Now it's time to go back and do a little bit of detail work. If you've watched any of my other painting videos, you know I'm a big fan of oil washes, and even on a project like this, they have their uses, though it's a lot more targeted and intentional than the all-over bath that I tend to give my rank-and-file tabletop models. For this job, I use a pre-made wash, a Scale 75 Earthworks Grease. It's a very dark brown that will help me tie a lot of this guy together. I hit the helmet and recesses of the coat with it pretty generously, and then get a lot more deliberate and delicate when it comes to deepening the shadows of the gold. What's nice is it naturally wants to go to the deepest parts of the model where the darkest shadows are going to be anyway. And after I let it sit for a bit, I can clean it back up to keep the highlights pretty bright. I've also gone in and given my bronze hourglass a bit of verdigris. I accidentally came across a good mix for this when mixing up dark sea blue and ice yellow for the sword. I add a little flow improver to help it get into the crevices and apply it somewhat sparingly, but enough to make it very clear that this is bronze and not gold. For the glass on that hourglass, I went from a progression of dark neutral gray to bright ivory with a little Payne's gray in the shadows. And for those specular highlights, I mixed bright ivory with white to help them really pop out of an otherwise fairly dark area of the model. Now, on a tabletop model or even a character level commission piece, I'd basically be done at this point once I get the light how I wanted it on the sword. But this is for a competition, so I go back again and hit those extreme highlights everywhere. This is also where I richened up the gold a little bit. I also worked the brightness back up a bit on the higher parts of the skull. I mixed in a little bit of Pro-Acryl orange into the copper to make it pop just a tiny bit more. And I also revisit the black one more time, doing a little edge highlighting with my initial cool light gray. Honestly, at this point, I was kind of bouncing all over the place, constantly adjusting gradients, hitting highlights, touching up little things here and there, and it's all kind of a blur. I did eventually paint the eyes red, I know that. I've heard Miniac, or maybe it was Ninjon, say you spend about half the time on a try-hard piece getting about the last 10% done. I'd never really appreciated that statement before trying to tackle this guy. For most tabletop or commission work, I'm pretty good at stopping at that 90% mark so I can move on to the next project. This time though, I went all in until I literally didn't want to look at this guy anymore. All in all, I probably spent close to 20 hours on him, which is insane for my normal level of hobby ADD on a single infantry-sized character. So I submitted the pics for the competition, then literally put him on the back of the shelf for a couple days. But when I pulled him back out, I was happy with how he'd come out. I definitely think I upped my non-metallic metal game, though it's still far from perfect, and I learned a lot about different textures. As for the contest itself, I doubt I'm gonna win. There are some amazing entries by some extremely skilled folks that I think are frankly better than mine, and that's okay. The goal here was to walk through my process and share some of my successes and frustrations encountered along the way. So, here he is. Now, YouTube tells me people like to skip ahead to the reveal on a video like this, so I'll take this opportunity to say that if you found my breakdown of the process useful or interesting, or just like this final reveal, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe on the video. I'm almost to 500, and I've got more hobby content in the works, and I also have a growing playlist of lore videos that you can listen to while you paint. That playlist should be on the screen right now if you'd like to take a listen. And until next time, remember, it's just paint, and thanks for watching.